Hello everyone, today we talk about the Saracens, which is a topic that we already addressed on Schwerpunkt, maybe not so often, but definitely in the essentials, right? Trying to frame it, to give a background to it, and I thought today to start telling a bit more of, let's say, evidential history, of course, with, enough criticism in it, talking about names, places, dates, right, things like these, chiefly about the moment of greater activity of the Saracens, meant as the period of the second invasions. Actually, you know that the term Saracen in itself is a pretty broad one that was used by the Europeans, that in fact called as Saracens or Agarans or Agaranians, actually. Agaranians, yes, in English. That is either, I mean, the etymologists disputed. Some say that were the sons of Sarah, right, or of Agar's sons, right. Sometimes I've read, telling the truth, that the etymology would come from the Sinai's tribe of the Sarkenoi, which was an ancient population inhabiting those areas that eventually became a synecdoche. In this, of course, pretty imprecise understanding that in the West there was of the various differences, even in the same Islamic religion. At the end of the day, these were figures that we listed that make reference to the biblical history of Abraham contained in the Genesis, the first book of the Bible, used in fact to call all those peoples of the Near East and of North Africa, right? And stressing, however, and perceiving the fact that something had happened down there, religiously speaking, that these peoples had embraced what we know, of course, today is Islam, but that in the West it wasn't quite clear, right? And that therefore differed from, albeit having Arab customs, right, and even speaking Arab, especially in their elites, they seem to not to be different, in fact, from the proper Arabs, chiefly for this religious aspect, because Mahometism was seen as this religion. Just think that in the 14th century, a man of extreme knowledge in most absolute terms of all the Middle Ages, like Dante, still talked about the Muslims too as fundamentally schismatic Christians that had denied the Trinity and pretended that God had no son, because forsooth he had no wife, right? This were the idea, so that in the broader Christian ecumenic world of the view, this anomaly had emerged, and of course during the time which in the 14th century, of course, the Europeans had been pretty well acquainted with the Muslims, not just during the Crusades, but also from before. But still, that tells you how sometimes it's not even important to understand certain specificities, but more broadly speaking, this gives you a view of how they looked at the world. They looked at this this new religion, and how they framed it, how try to make sense of it, because the whole thing was framed, in fact, into this mainly mainstream Christian idea that had to find justification for anomalies, right? And there was a great problem, even, I don't know, with the discovery of the Americas, for example, that, presented what were these peoples, who did they descend from, biblically speaking, and opening and challenge. But this is not what we're talking about. This was just a small digression, just to stress the what we talk about the Saracens, right? The Saracens at this point can fit basically everything from literally the early Muslim invasions to, I don't know, the Saracens meant whoever was Muslim in every medieval or even early modern context. I don't know, that can be extended. Today we talk chiefly about what we consider as to the second invasions, maybe starting from a step backwards, from maybe the origins or not much of Islam, but at least the Muslim conquest of Syria and Egypt, right? Because today we're going to talk chiefly about the sea, about the Mediterranean, and focus our attention where the Saracens hit the hardest, right? And you could say, well, that's the Iberian Peninsula because they even conquered it almost all of it. Well, yeah, okay, but that's something different. That's the center of a very solid centralized power that this is the Umayyad Caliphate that will live on right up to the 11th century, when it would be disgregated into the taifas. But actually, the Saracen piracy, as we mostly framed that phenomenon, like in our minds, it hits pretty hard into the central Mediterranean, chiefly the Italian peninsula, southern France, that is also very deeply overlooked, and also the eastern Mediterranean, but now we will explain how in different ways. And we want to concentrate chiefly on the first one, on the Italian peninsula, because that's a place where the Saracen invasions not only had a greater impact overall, but also triggered certain important transformations that paradoxically, on the long run, the same coastal towns of the Mediterranean and even the Adriatic Sea would partly benefit from, including the construction of for example, a naval military culture, that maritime culture that would develop and would actually be the protagonist in the shift of the trade balance from Islam, from the South Mediterranean to Christian Europe, right? From Southern Europe, from which eventually all this the wealth was starting being accumulated, were actually some of the most important achievements in medieval civilization emerged from. And this is quite of a controversial and fascinating take on that part of history, chiefly also because we know terribly few about those times and places. Like in the 9th and 10th centuries, okay, yeah, the places like the Italian peninsula were fairly well documented for those time standards, but still we can understand a few. If you take even, for example, Muslim Sicily, you hear lots of things, actually, and I don't know, these are historiographical, maybe interpretations and criticism, but what happened there is very, very often beyond our comprehension. Even though, of course, for the people who inhabited there, that was kind of the center of their perspective and whatever. But I don't know, most of the things we know about it come from Fatimid Egypt. Even the Byzantine Empire, that had pretty solid interest in southern Italy and was in contact with Orthodox communities that had been left behind with the Muslim conquest of Sicily, didn't quite know or refer to those places. So there are many areas of which we understand some phenomena, but from just a very broad perspective, and that yet after a couple of centuries where these invasions basically stop, or basically they are reversed, in the sense it's now these Italian coastal communities that take the upper hand and start re-expanding. That's also very, we think about crusades, we think about the Reconquista as well, Reconquista being fairly overlooked as well, compared to crusades. We often don't concentrate on the central Mediterranean, what happened in the coastal cities of Italy, for example, of the Tyrrhenian Sea especially, and in relation with the Saracens. So today we won't be covering that, because fundamentally we will looking at the initial period and kind of the most intense phase. We won't be looking at the emancipation phase, at the striking back phase, we could say. But it's pretty clear, and I think I explained this well enough in that video about rereading the Saracens, slavery, Persian trade in Mediterranean. What there is probably to find out, still historically speaking, or to reframe or to reinterpret in a certain sense, relatively to especially the developments that would follow the Saracen age. That it wasn't a moment like an atomic bomb that fell on these communities and they had to rebuild everything from scratch. Nothing at all, right? There was a definitely a very troubled moment, right? In terms of warfare, devastations, etc. But this was paralleled constantly by the extreme development of certain communities that, in fact, after the centuries reappear magically, like with hell of navies, hell of shipbuilding capabilities, hell of wealth that must have been built into this broader net, partly of Islamic traffics, but not only, right? Because also the local areas sometimes were partially unaffected by this phenomena, or at least they had the resources to revive their own power, to react to that and to form. And this is very interesting because relatively to our military historical interests specifically, you understand that war has this incredible catalyst capacity either of destroying entire areas or making them develop further, especially in terms of centralization, right? When you think about the for example, the Italian maritime republics, that is a phenomenon that we mostly study rightfully in the low Middle Ages for the center, the north of the peninsula, and that at this time was developing. Actually, most of the first activity started in the south, in this basically autonomous Byzantine city-states, right, of the southern Italian coast that began to interact pretty independently, in fact, as political military actors exactly during this moment. And this area is key, is of key importance to understand a great part, I think, of high medieval history, and is incredibly overlooked and just dealt as, these were small things, we don't really care about them. Well, they were actually some most important chapters in medieval history, and it's still partly overlooked, right? Especially in a comprehensive sense. Not that the single histories have not been studied, but it's the general meaning that I think we could try to reinterpret in certain ways. But aside from this, we know that with the Muslim conquest of Syria and Egypt, lots of things had changed in Mediterranean, right? There had been a great shift for which Islam had acquired expert sailors, mariners, and that had definitely given them a new reason for which to fight, to conquer, right, to win, right? Never underestimate in all this conflictual dimension that it wasn't at all like a dualist system for which from one side were the Christians, from one other side were the Muslims, and everything was about this dichotomy. Basically, the thing in the very middle was extremely blurred, right? And today we will provide enough evidence for this. Not because there was anything that we have to interpret like there weren't religious clashes or these peoples liked each other. No, it has nothing to do with that, because human beings have always disliked each other since ever, right? It's one of our fundamental we basically exist as a species because we have acquired those traits, right? Because otherwise we would have extinguished. We need to discriminate in the sense of trying to make this distinctions and operating accordingly, but at the same time these distinctions take the shape of an extremely complicated pattern that no sensible historical, a person, not even a historian, let's say, but someone who has a minimal or elementary historical knowledge can interpret like it was just Christians versus Muslims, right? The history of this period is not this. It's never been this, and not even in those times in which such things were considered tendentially towards that reason. Nobody ever dreamt to draw them in this way. Unfortunately, there are many people who do, right? And they do fundamentally because of either radical ignorance or radical ideologism, which is most of the times the same thing. At least they are always present at the same time. And true history is not ideological. It shouldn't be. It doesn't have any meaning. If you want to use history for your political agendas or whatever, do it, but just be aware that there is a logic into it that you can't interpret on the base of that. That is, you can't pretend to know history just because of your even neutral prejudices, right? You have to objectify what you're talking about, and not just trying to make it fit in a preconceived notion that you hope to be true or correct, because this is what in every decent academy in the world it's forbidden, right? And you can't even pass a basic medieval history exam reasoning in that fashion. And so the Syrians and the Egyptians, especially, they were ancient populations, as you know. They had particular civilization, culture, language, customs. They had their own regional dimension. They were populations of ancient Christianization, right? That, however, had adhered since the 4th, 5th century, roughly, to the Monophysite creed, right? And at that point, hated, loathed, to put it quite simply, the despotic and rapacious Byzantine government that dealt with them as heretics, which in part was true, but it was mostly a clash of elites, generally speaking. These provinces were of dramatic importance, especially for the supplies of Constantinople, for feeding the mob, for maintaining enough stocks, etc. The loss of Syria and Egypt would cause pivotal transformations into Byzantine history. It will shift mainly to a Pontic dimension with Black Sea and the Ukrainian grain. It would change a lot of things, and these regions definitely were proud. They had, in fact, their own important past. They felt to be, as they were at that point, objectively as subjects, and they tried to come out of there. Right? They weren't like poor, oppressed people. They were actually powerful. Especially the ecclesiastical hierarchies had a great autonomy and prestige, etc. And they saw fit the opportunity of the Muslim invasions and the general exhaustion of the empire's military capabilities to autonomize themselves, and these regions were largely conquered thanks even to the support of the local population that literally opened the gate to the Muslims, right? And this is not a mystery for anyone. As you know, the imperial power had started assuming, especially since the 6th century, this very strongly Caesar-papistic and exclusivistic religious policies. Certain, even in the same Greece and kind of closer areas to Constantinople, there had been a grip on and an exclusion. For example, the shutting down of the Athenian school of philosophy, the persecution of the Jews, and other measures that were aimed at reinforcing central power, controlling the local communities. And therefore these Syria and Egypt had started to be dealt with like rebels, right? There had been a time in which the empire had tried to wink at them, dogmatically speaking, by starting to support monophysitism in kind of ambiguous ways, but all these things had not worked, right? And the empire had kept oppressing them, with taxes, certain public, the mandatory public services, deportations, right? And therefore, for this population, the passage to Islam that considered all the Christians as people of the book, as yimmi, that is subjects / protege, and therefore free to exercise in a private fashion their own cult, right, without being harassed and paying actually lower taxes than the ones that the empire had required, had objectively represented a sort of liberation, and even in certain cases a chance of social promotion right, for these populations that started participating, in fact, in the local Muslim administration, right? You know that the Islam coming out literally out of the desert didn't quite have the intellectual or economical or artisanal technical means to manage an empire. If you wonder how and why the early Islamic conquests were so successful, well, because they were largely backed by all these populations that passed under their control so quickly, so easily, right? Because these local human resources were able to fit into the administrative structures of a new independent power that, in this sense, could benefit, from which the locals could benefit, as it would happen. And we know that the Syrians and the Egyptians were also skilled shipbuilders, right? So this caused that the shift of many of this knowledge and practices in shipbuilding in the hands of the Muslims, and thus from that moment onwards the control of the Eastern Mediterranean passed from the Byzantine Empire to the Islamic potentates, right? Largely all over the Mediterranean, right? The Byzantines maintained important control, of course, chiefly on the Aegean, that however starting to be harassed. Like the Muslims arrived to besiege Constantinople by sea. They were quite a pervasive force, much of which wasn't even just regular navies. There were pirates, right? And also on that chapter of Eastern Mediterranean piracy, there would be a lot to talk about. Like, we think that was chiefly Muslim piracy, completely false. It was plenty of Byzantine pirates as well. We incidentally fought sometimes quite against the same empire, or talking about a specifically Muslim or Christian piracy in the Eastern Mediterranean, as much as in the West, telling the truth, is very misleading, right? And it's much more complicated than that. Fortunately, historiography is clarifying that pretty thoroughly. As I said before, this is not much a matter of faith. This is a matter that every time an empire collapses, there's a major force that is torn down, is resized, like in the case of the Byzantine Empire now. Everybody's going to profit from that. It happened for the Roman Empire, it happened for the Carolingian Empire, it happened for the Byzantine Empire. It would happen also for Islamic powers, right, and themselves eventually. Pirates have no fate, no color, nor they do have it, but they do what they do otherwise, right? And in any case, and that's not the point, right? But strategically speaking, it was a hell of a problem for Constantinople, of course, as it started to be for the same Muslims that, of course, had ambivalent relations with the empire. Not all Muslim powers were actually enemy of the empire. Sometimes they were also allies, as it's widely known, and this is to be found basically everywhere, right? And there was a substantial. I made several videos at this point showing how many mercenaries existed, like how many Christians fought in Muslim armies as much as many Muslims fought into Christian armies, and this is not a mystery for anyone who knows the military history of those times. But aside from this, the maritime dimension has a big importance. Because the Mediterranean is big, and as you know, the same Islamic Empire, after this extreme phase of expansion, right, from which the Muslim armies stretch now from the Atlantic Ocean to India, this big system starts crumbling itself and fragmenting into several different powers. So without a a unique political center, but several, right? And all acting kind of in their own autonomous way, right? The fact that the myth that the Islamic invasions gave once again unity, political unity to places like the Near East, but it's completely false. Actually, the Islamic invasions brought to a complete fragmentation that was political, was religious, was partly ethnical as well, because lots of new things were put in motion, and this system at one point came to expand, in fact, in a world that was fundamentally contracting. Like the same Islamic world would contribute to keep a general system of, of production, of organization, of administration alive, right? The Muslims would control this major traffics from Europe to Southeast Asia. And they would flourish on their own, but still they were developing in a moment where resources were broadly limited, right? Always remember that the Muslims came to conquer vast areas that had been exhausted by the century lasting clash between the Roman and the Persian Empire. So this world, even at the beginning, where we usually say, oh well, that more or less it was compact, was already decentralized, was already full of islands, of communities, of different sects and confessions, etc. Let's say that had different identities, different directions, right, and that acted accordingly. So this is evident as well in the Mediterranean, right? These Muslim powers went shaping themselves, especially in the North African coast west of the Sirte, which is today called still in Arab the Al-Maghreb. That means literally the west, in fact. That is considered, in fact, also an area that from a strictly say orthodox point of view in the Muslim world has a slightly negative meaning too, because North Africa is the land of Islam, yes, but it's kind of more pagan, like, it's close to this Berber world that still holds kind of primitive beliefs, where the magician, the dark magician, comes always in the Islamic tales comes always from North Africa, right? It's this area in between, a suspended world where the true civilization is the Mashriq, right? It's in Damascus, it's in Baghdad, right, where the caliphal capitals were. And the Muslims expanded also beyond, of course, on the coasts of the Iberian Peninsula and in the Balearic Islands that already in 798 had been invested by the Muslim incursions, even if their definite conquest at the hand of a Islamic Iberian chieftain would have occurred only in 902. And never underestimate, this is the real key to understand this process, is that these powers weren't much an Arab thing, right? These entities had an Arabicized elite. They were formally Muslim, but actually were the expression of local populations. You can't pretend that the Arab demographic strength was ridiculous compared to the one that they came to extend their territory. Of course, it was mostly, this Islamic conquest, a chance of autonomization of certain communities that took the opportunity to start building something on their own. It wasn't largely a, we don't have to interpret it as a progress, right? In my opinion, it was negative in the measure in which it led to fragmentation, initially especially, because that also created more competition, more production. It was all a culture and a civilization that developed from here. New cities were formed. If you go to my medieval Islam playlist, you will find at a certain point it talks also about these great, say, capitals, very often at the outskirts of the Muslim world. Think about Bukhara, think about Kairouan in Tunisia, that we'll talk about today with the Aghlabides and the Zirids, etc. But sometimes you find also a greater continuity with more centralized powers that were basically overlapping pre-existing realities. I think the most evident of this one is the Umayyad Caliphate of Cordoba, right? That is this relic of the larger Umayyad Caliphate that, centered in Damascus, that encompassed the whole Dar al-Islam, theoretically, but that is overthrown by the Abbasids and remains into this fundamentally Iberian power. It's an Iberian state, right? And even if, the word injection of this, I don't know, Berber or other North African elements, it was fundamentally an Iberian power, and it was working largely, in fact, with in a process of assimilation of the Arab conquerors by the locals, right? And that's the point. It was more the local cultures that contributed to give new sap to what the Arabs had structured like a eminently political and military power. And you can easily find this. Like, it's obvious that there is even an environmental evidence, right? The most important centers were, of course, in Spain, in Egypt, in Mesopotamia, because those are obviously centers of power, fertile lands with natural resources, etc., that can support a more centralized power. So there is all a geography of it that, and a continuity with the pre-existing realities that cannot be told like, Islam came, everything changed. Sometimes it didn't change very much after all. And in the with all the distinctions, of course. But so what were these entities sometimes? Well, most of them, especially smaller ones, were the so-called Emirates, right? The Emir in Arab, it would be Amir, that means prince or military chief, right? That has this, in fact, strongly kind of military character. The Amir is technically the one who has to lead militarily the troops, right? Then there is the Malik. This is more like a king, which also had a negative semantic shade in Arab, because the Islamic political culture doesn't see very favorably hereditary rulers as such. The Malik kind of usurped what its Allah's power and herd that is embodied, is represented by instead the Caliph, that is the truly ecumenic, universal authority that rules over the Dar al-Islam, right? So they were embracing the typical ecumenism of every great empire, even being inspired by the great Roman and Persian imperial models, of course. And these emirates were smaller entities that were sometimes based on a city, usually, and the main activity of which was the corsair war on the sea, right? Quite simply. And in the Mediterranean, that's of course inevitable from one side, especially from the African side, because as you know, in the hinterland you have the desert, and therefore it's natural to be projected on the sea, right? And more than, of course, what it's from the northern side of the Mediterranean, where you have pretty extensive and fertile and rich hinterland instead. That also, in fact, had also much greater damic capability, right? As Westerners, sometimes we are obsessed with the idea of how much this Islamic conquest came as an external thing to alter even the local damic balance. Well, actually not, because Europe, even at this time of the very early Middle Ages, was overwhelmingly demographically superior to North Africa, and historically speaking, much even during the same Middle Ages, was much of a influence from the south coast of the Mediterranean rather from the north, that had a much more polarizing effect. And that's part of the reason why the the Saracens went towards the north, because that's where the opportunities were, that's where the situation to exploit laid. Mm. Now, interestingly enough, all of these emirates, technically, Islam is like Christianity in terms of political culture. There is an ecumenic power, right? So everybody who is Muslim technically belongs to the caliphate, ideally, right? In practice, these emirates were independent, right? It's a bit like the Byzantine Empire and the rest of Europe. Theoretically, Christianity should have a single empire, right? That covers all, that belongs to every Christianity, that overlaps with the church, that defends, that is there chiefly actually to defend and protect the church. Instead, the whole Western Europe is Christian. It's Christian, but it's doing whatever the heck they want, right? And they progressively also differentiate from the East, Eastern Christianity. Well, here something similar happens, as every emirate technically seeks the legitimization from the caliphal power, but de facto they were independent, right? The formal recognition of authority was usually sought from at least one of the three major caliphs that between the 8th and the 11th century were sharing the spiritual hegemony. And sometimes the true, real political power of Islam, and of course we're talking about the Sunni Abbasid one of Baghdad, the Shia Fatimid one of Cairo, and the Sunni Umayyad one of Cordoba, right? So there are these three very important blocks that we already talked about, right? So in order now, Mesopotamia, Egypt, and Spain, or the Iberian Peninsula if you prefer. These are big powers. Like the influence even of the Abbasid Caliphate is that doesn't at a point, especially with the Fatimid expansion in Syria, is cut off from the Mediterranean in practice, still has an enormous importance, right? There is all a political gaming within these powers that compete and that are still important. There are lots of influences that are also national, we could say, between these chunks of Islam that make people coming from the most diverse corners of the Islamic world, right? As I like always say, you think of all the various schools of Islamic law, for example, that have a broad international interconnection still today. At the time, for example, Umayyad Spain was in strong contact with Yemen, right? There were influences coming in from Central Asia up to southern Spain. So the Mediterranean middle and all these influences mixing, right? All these emirates had their own corsair ships, which infested the Mediterranean and aggressing the coastal and islander centers of Christianity. Also the Byzantine navies, right? There's another very important thing to point out in here is realizing who has a navy or not. Here we're talking about early medieval times. You don't have powers with permanent fleets, essentially, but the Byzantines, right? And I made a video about Byzantine navies of roughly this times, highlighting how, of course, this was an extraordinary exception, right? But it doesn't mean, however, that the Byzantines could control everywhere. At this point, the controlling the seas is practically impossible. The navies usually had chiefly the task of supporting land armies, right? Marching usually on the coasts, and this navies function mostly as logistical connectors, etc. And as a consequence, even naval clashes were pretty rare. fleets also costed a lot. Usually this clashes were trying to be avoided, also because the way they fought was pretty mechanical and largely also difficultly controllable. It was muscle to muscle at the end of the day. Naval technology had somewhat readapted to certain strategic needs and resources availability of the time. So now it's complicated to talk about it. But the point here is that the Byzantines, if you want, since the Justinian Reconquest, had operated and reached a thalassocracy, right, in the Mediterranean. With the losses of the Egyptian and Syrian shipyards, things had gone differently, right? So there were Muslim fleets scattered a bit everywhere. There was usually autonomous maritime powers. There weren't like a major statal fleet, right? This was rare in the Muslim world as well, but piracy was endemic. And the problem is that the western half of the Mediterranean, right, didn't quite have a true military and naval military capability on its own, right? Between the 9th and the 10th century, there weren't basically navies, aside from, of course, at some point the Vikings entered the Mediterranean. The Venetians were starting to develop already at this point something on their own, but substantially all this big area goes from Gibraltar Strait to the east up to basically the straits of Sicily. Well, was not defended from the Christian side by a navy. So, as a consequence, the European coasts and great islands of the Mediterranean were repeatedly hit by the Saracen incursions, and in many cases subjected to their settlement or sometimes to their conquest, right? As we will see later, this expansion wasn't quite a truly structural one. You know, the Saracens came to rule on systems that already worked on their own and that they exploited in this sense. They didn't quite build much on their own, right? They mostly seized important assets, and of course, these also changed the history of the locals, which sometimes were framed into even larger. I don't know, for example, if you take Muslim Palermo, it was the capital of Aghlabide, Sicily. Well, that was a hell of a city that in Byzantine times had not been. It was a major commercial center that was extremely important in the Islamic world. It was connected to all the traffics of this intercontinental trade that the Muslims held between West and East. Also, Muslim Sicily wasn't actually this paradise that is often depicted. Actually, the picture is much grimmer than but today we won't be talking about that either, but just for saying that these powers, mostly these Emirates chiefly, while for Spain you can say, well, that was a hell of a power, it was a real state. When you look at the central Mediterranean, you don't really see much of a true hegemonic power. It's Tunisia fundamentally and its surroundings that form a pool of power, because Tunisia has enough agricultural resources to sustain kind of a large power, and these are all bases that had already existed before. The Vandals had started their own maritime empire from there, occupying exactly the same areas more or less than these Aghlabides, for example, were ruling on. So this continuity is also very, very important. And so naturally, the favorite aim of the Muslim corsairs would have been the actually Byzantine coast that at the time was much more flourishing and densely populated than the coasts would have been the former Pars Occidentes, right, of the empire. But the problem is that the Byzantine coasts, in spite of the crisis of the empire, the shrinking of the borders, the centralization of the civil and military administration was still, you know, enough well protected by the imperial fleet. So as a consequence, the easiest and most practical, convenient direction was instead all these part of the Mediterranean that stretched west of the Channel of Sicily, right? Also in here, be always mindful of, for example, we talked about Italy before, but Italy also in here instead was kind of split in these two sides of the coast. Like the southeastern part was much more of a still Byzantine business, right? The western side on the Mediterranean was quite of another thing. As a consequence, there were territories that remained formally Byzantine that were left kind of on their own. So in Africa, as we have seen, this region roughly corresponding to northeastern Tunisia, the Ifriqiya, that's how in Arabic was called because of the ancient Roman name of Africa, right? Was settled by this Arab Berber dynasty of the Aghlabide Emirs, with its center in Kairouan, which was a city of new foundation, it's from this region that started the Islamic occupation of Sicily from the side of the Aghlabide Emir Ziyad Allah I. It started in 827, ending at the beginning of the following century. Actually, the conquest of Sicily was pretty long, for many reasons. It definitely started this. It was the starting point of almost 2 centuries of Saracen supremacy over this vast body of water comprehended between the Iberian Peninsula, the Italic Peninsula, and the Maghreb, right? However, the Byzantines that were in control of Sicily before the invasion, of course, and even during the invasion, fought back, right? Even with valor, actually, the Muslim advance on the island. I've heard several stories when it comes down to determine what exactly happened, but this is like sometimes people say the local Sicilian population also had this extreme resistance against the Muslims. Others say that the conquest was relatively easy. The truth is that we don't know. I actually spoke with a PhD student that is studying exactly this. Actually, the Greek Orthodox communities in this moment during the Islamic occupation of Sicily. And consequently also about the conquest. And the problem is that we know frustratingly few about whatever happened in there. The Muslim conquest of Sicily was also quite particular because it kind of altered the local distribution of land. Like the great Byzantine latifundia were basically pulverized, right, into small and middle landed property, which actually wasn't that, let's say, remunerating, at least for central power, because as a consequence, even though an Aghlabide dominion is quite indicative of the general weakness of this Saracen powers, generally speaking, meaning that they were quite unstable, right? There were constant rebellions and basically Islamic Sicily was controlled by the Aghlabides only in the western half, which means that in the eastern half, after the fall of Taormina, it was the last Byzantine stronghold, there were Muslims, but they escaped Palermo's control. The reason being that if you really want to rule a land, you shouldn't leave the wealth into the hands of many people, right? Because otherwise you don't have power on your own to control it. And this happened not because the Muslims were stupid, but because of the nature of this conquest that was essentially pretty autonomous, right? We said the story, Ziyad Allah I landed in Sicily and conquered, well, but it was actually much more I mean, there are many analogies objectively, even with Viking invasions. I mean, they were largely autonomous by a certain degree. Mm? And it's often overlooked how, in fact, unstable this area was. That's why trade flourished, but if we were actually to determine how much the local, even, for example, from the Islamic domination in Sicily. I mean, in Sicily you get lots of things from the Romans, from the Greeks, from the Normans, from the Angevins. Angevins not much lasted a few, but other from the Islamic period. There's basically nothing remaining, right? There are maybe mostly Islamic influences at the time of Norman domination, but in between it's not that this was a power that left massive infrastructures that operated, because it was very fragmented, it was very dynamic, it was a great center, a marketplace if you want, of slaves, of spices, of other resources, but it wasn't quite a state as we indicated. In fact, I have personally enormous doubts when you read on those books that the Normans eventually conquered Sicily and they established such a an effective government, because they copied the centralized structures of the Muslim courts. Meaning that probably was something already standing in there. Well, surely it happened by a certain degree, but I personally don't see that. I mean, we don't. I think we lack. We have the names maybe of that office that even under Norman administration maintained Arab name, for example, as if as well as like Greek or Latin names for that matter as well. But where is this continuity with a former administration is frankly very difficult to determine, in my opinion. And I came because I also believed actually that Islamic Sicily was quite a flourishing thing. Well, it is true. I mean, that there were lots of, especially economically speaking, even in agriculture, there were lots of fruits that were also imported, a lot of tradition. That is true. But that there was a civil, unity, solidity of this dominion, well, it's very difficult to assess. And this paid very bad the Muslims at the times of the Norman invasion in the half of the 11th century, because at that time basically the Normans, that were an extremely aggressively shaped political and military system, conquer Sicily without meeting any particular resistance. Yes, they have to besiege city after city, also because the Sicilian hinterland is a freaking mess, and you have to stop by and besieging. But they didn't find any cohesive enemy. Right, most Muslims even fled back to Tunisia, and the conquests were generally pretty easy. But this is another story. The point, though, is once again there was a continuity, even of Christian communities that were here. The monks, the great Greek monasteries of Sicily remained. Sometimes they changed place because they feared to be harassed. They escaped into the mountains and stuff like that, but seemingly there was a coexistence that is reflected also in the kind of multicultural character that Sicily had still at the time of Norman conquest. Excuse me. So the conquest of Sicily, as we said before, was very long. It ended only at the beginning of the 10th century. Eventually, there were two other major Islamic conquests at that time. The one of Crete in 827. That was really a pain in the behind for the Byzantines, because until it was reconquered together with Cyprus, etc., it was quite of a problem for the Aegean. That was kind of a natural pool of trade and wealth for the Byzantines, or the few that had remained to them, and Malta in 870. This basically took away from Constantinople the basis that allowed her to intervene effectively into the Western Mediterranean. It's basically closed, right? There is the Strait of Messina. Then you have the Muslims hold Sicily. They hold Malta. Right, they even hold Crete, right? So all your problems are concentrated at that point in the Eastern Mediterranean. It becomes extremely difficult to do anything, even into this southern Italian area, and you can imagine into the Western Mediterranean as well. It's very complicated. And as a consequence, for example, not just Sicily, of course, but even Sardinia were abandoned to their own destiny. Sardinia has a particular history in this context because it was probably already largely autonomous on its own. You know that Sardinia has seemingly a political and juridical administration that bore seemingly a great continuity with the Byzantine times. That has also been magnified, right? But Sardinia, telling the truth, wasn't this great example of administration, right? It was an area that, coastally speaking, especially in the south, has this plain agricultural fertile land with the city of Calaris. It was an ancient city of old colonization that somewhat even had a maritime autonomy in later times. It was pretty damn. It was hit pretty damn hard by the Muslims. The Sardinian hinterland is hell, meaning that it's unfertile. There is malaria. The land is a mess. There are mountains. It's cold. It snows in there. There are these warlike shepherds that do not want you to mess up with. Nobody would venture in there. So it basically, even if the coasts were occupied by the Muslims, the island and the hinterland usually, but as it happened also in the rest of history, kind of kept functioning on its own, but definitely wasn't a happy island on its by itself in this context. And therefore there is a transformation. There's not what I would like to stress in here is that there's not a unified, uniform, structured Muslim power that you find in Spain, but in this area it's all fluctuating, right? It's all very fluctuating, like also in southern France, and we will get to it now in later on. In fact, a general myth that maybe we can try to dispel here, because we know it's actually a myth, historiographically speaking, is that the Saracen incursions and settlement were interpreted through kind of autonomous will of expansion from the Islamic side, at the base of which there would have been precise strategical choices. Telling the truth, it's nothing like that, right? At least it's not. It's largely not true from what we can see. On the contrary, we see that the Saracens often entered like pretty easily in these local clashes, right? That happened basically all around in Christian powers, by taking sides, right? First for one party, then from the other of the contendants, and it wasn't at all rare that it was the same Christians that called the Saracens, right? This is typical. You find it basically everywhere at this point. It's what happened, for example, with the Varangians and the Rus, right? Excuse me, with the Slavs, I meant, and the Varangians, right? There were these pirates wandering around. They were starting being hired as military, as mercenaries, as sometimes even as rulers, as we will see now. And it happened with the Saracens. In the case of the Saracens, it's very meaningful because you realize that here there was not a clash like between these two sides of the islands. There were the same Christians that said, "Okay, Saracens, come here because I don't like my neighbor. Can you raise it to the ground, please?" And they did, right? That's literally what they did. And the picture naturally was very complicated by the fact that, of course, these guys weren't doing that for free. They wanted to benefit somewhat from it, and they were also pretty good at doing it. Okay, and for example, the Saracens that were conquering Sicily still, and that had just conquered Palermo, for example, were called, right? They were exhorted by Andrew, consul of Naples, that had already turned, uselessly to the Carolingian Emperor Louis the Pious, right, to come in support of his own city against Sico. There was the Longobard Prince of Benevent, there was extorting money and pillaging continuously the Campanian territory. This is very meaningful because here basically you have the council, which is basically a local title, like for the chief of the city council, etc., of a technically still Byzantine city-state, like Naples is. This is one of the most important in this time. That is calling the Saracens to fight against the Longobards in the hinterland. Right, this is pretty meaningful. The Principality of Benevent here was a big power at the time. Right, it covered large areas of southern Italy in the hinterland and was historically against the Byzantine coastal centers. So these were great enmities that dated back to a long time before. So when in 832 Sico was succeeded by his son Sicard, things didn't get any better, and therefore Amalfi, Sorrento, and Gaeta, that were all three other kind of Byzantine maritime cities, right, that along the Tyrrhenian coast, associated themselves into the request of the Neapolitans to the Saracens. Right. So what happens here is that the Saracens actually behaved themselves very correctly in this case. They helped the Campanian cities. They obliged the Beneventan prince to retreat and to sign with this Byzantine coastal cities a treaty of friendship and of trade. Right. And the one thing, of course, was happening with these cities acting in a completely independent way from Constantinople, that had nothing, okay, maybe not nothing, but now very few to do with what was happening, right? These cities now were behaving like city-states, independent city-states. They had their own small navies, their own trade, commercial interests. They made a lot of money with the Islamic trade as well, right? So this tells you a little bit about what I was talking about at the beginning. Like, how is that these cities, Amalfi here, what is Amalfi? Amalfi is the first and initially most important Italian maritime republic. And that emerges exactly, in fact, in the 9th century. And what's the 9th century? The moment in which the Saracens hit the hardest. You go look at its history, you find out that even though Amalfi will actually fight pretty hard against the Saracens later on, well, this was already a hell of a power at the time. So you can't presume that here the Saracens simply homogeneously invested the southern Italian coastal cities and destroyed everything. No, they were acting here very carefully with every single entity and even supporting them in this specific case. And these cities were even developing their own navies that they would eventually use to kick the Saracens out at one point of the peninsula, like it happened at the Battle of Ostia, as we will see later, but even at the Battle of the Garigliano in 915. It was a very important battle that got rid of most of Saracen piracy into central Italy. So, always on that occasion, and comprehensively, the Neapolitans were grateful for the Saracen help, and they supported, in turn, the Muslims during the siege of Messina in 843. Right? This is extremely meaningful. You find here Naples, that is technically, formally, let's say, a Byzantine power that supports the Muslims in Sicily that are besieging a Byzantine stronghold, Messina, the one that controls the straits, right? So that tells you all, right? We will see how eventually they would repent for supporting the Saracens too much, but we don't have to reason like a posteriori, right? Because these were extremely fluid political systems where nobody knew, nobody could foresee what would happen. Like today, you look at what the war in Syria has been. Look at all the alliances that have been forged. they're all contingent, right? We don't know what will happen in 4 months from now. Military analysts know that. You can't formulate that. There is no way to predict it. Equally in those times. And this, more than speaking to you about the enmity between Christians and Muslims, if anything, it tells you, first of all, something very different from that. But aside from it, which wasn't friendship either, it tells you how something very important. First of all, how largely decentralized these powers now were from Byzantine central government. Secondly, how much Muslim trade looked profitable for these cities, and also, how the wall, how it was perfectly normal to resort to such solutions to solve problems, right? Like, fighting against a local enemy. But not only, in 846, the Neapolitans helped the Muslims even in occupying Cape Licosa and the islands of Ischia and Ponza, that are also pretty close to Naples, telling the truth. So that is even more meaningful. And once again, it was the Neapolitans, always at the with the purpose to create difficulties to the Longobard Prince of Benevent, to make use of the Saracens of Sicily by pushing them in 833 to assault Brindisi in Apulia. This is important because the Longobards were expanding towards the east. Benevent, that Brindisi was one of the major ports. On the east, it was a very important Roman port since ancient times, and its conquest meant a lot, even for the Longobards that, albeit living in the hinterland now, were trying to expand in these coastal centers that evidently already tell you that, weren't threatened by this constant piracy for which seizing a port was a bad affair. No. It's exactly probably because there was a lot of piracy that they wanted to conquer a port, because they knew what they could benefit from by using this maritime power and infrastructures. After a while, by profiting of a civil war between the southern Italic Longobards after the death of the Prince Sicard in 839, the Muslims started pressuring and endly seizing two very important cities in southern Italy that are Taranto and Bari. Now, these two cities are very, very important because Taranto is a natural port. It has kind of two ports in one. It was one of the most, and it still is technically one of the most important naval bases in the Mediterranean. And Bari, that is also a very important coastal center that has most of this access to the surrounding land. It is extremely fertile, right? And in fact, also the Normans will settle around there, make it very... it will even give trouble because locally it's always full of resources, so they could autonomize themselves from Sicily in part at the time of the Norman kingdoms and the local barons, and in the same Byzantines that in the 12th century would start in there. In fact, a revolt of the Norman barons against the kings in Sicily. And the full, so you understand in a context that is so politically fragmented what it means for the Saracens to occupy such major centers. In fact, especially Bari would become the center of an emirate that had a fairly long life for the time, at least considering what it was. I mean, it wasn't nothing like a power, but it still was an important place to hold. That, in fact, the Muslims controlled between 840 and 871. Just reflect what the whole situation here is. Even in the Carolingian world, in the Byzantine world, like at this point, the main problem, in fact, came from the east. Like the Franks were lost into intestine warfare, etc. And at that point, Constantinople and the Venetians are pretty damn worried about the control of these two ports by the Muslims, because it basically choked the Otranto Strait between the Adriatic Sea and Greece. Failed, right? A large Venetian fleet was destroyed by the Muslims. That, as a retaliation, actually they pushed it up to the Carnar, right, in the very north of the Adriatic Balkanic coast, and very able to, very skilled in exploiting the confusion and the weakness of different powers that in full discord between them agitated themselves into southern Italy. The Saracens placed themselves unscrupulously at the service, sometimes of the same pretenders to the Beneventan throne, and in practice kind of ruling the Dutch in that sense, right, or having a determinant influence of what was happening there. So a very strong presence, actually, at least from a political point of view. And consider that this always was done without, in fact, having a state. The Saracen invasions weren't like a form of colonization, right? They weren't massive amount of, demic concentrations, the foundation of news. No, they usually occupied strongholds. It was mostly a military and economic thing. It resembles much to Carthaginian colonization. It was very different from the Hellenic one, for example. It was a demic one. These forms of settlement were very they were light, objectively. They were aimed just at exploiting the economical benefit, and there was no way to further trying to make the hinterland Islamic, for example. Just in Sicily, that is an island on its own, it has enough resources for the local government to try to control the island. But if you start venturing into the hinterland in southern Italy, it's all mountains populated by pretty rough populations, terrible ground for everyone, and so it was impractical. It was mostly, in fact, a maritime business, because these powers lacked the Saracens lacked the resources to further invest into the hinterland. That usually, in fact, remained isolated from them. They took refuge in the mountains. They kind of entrenched and fortified themselves, and they left sometimes the coasts simply to the Saracens. Sometimes they couldn't even defend it, so they would simply run away, let the Saracens raid, or even just paying a tribute to them, because that also happened, and they would go away at one point. Of course, there was a permanent control of certain very long parts of the coast on several occasions, but it was in fact the coasts, right? The situation, however, was growing dramatic, in fact, exactly for the coastal centers. Right, in the same companion cities that had presumed to, with impunity, let's say, to use of this Arab Berbers, they acknowledged the mistake that now the overexpansion of the Saracens had entailed for them. Consequently, these coastal centers decided to unite with the Longobard princes, so with their usual enemies, to implore the help of, at least again, the help of the Carolingian Emperor Lothar, 840-855. That probably would have neither moved himself if the Saracens that occupied the peninsula hadn't felt themselves so confident to penetrate in 846 up to Ostia, so at the port of Rome itself, and to sail up the river Tiber and sacking the Basilica of St. Peter, right, and profanating it. So this was a very serious business, because in all of this picture, we haven't referred to what the Carolingians were doing, right? Southern Italy was fundamentally a frontier area between the Byzantine Empire and the Carolingian Empire. So in the center, in the north of Italy, there was a Carolingian kingdom, right? Italy had a kingdom on its own that was also not even too bad. Like, it was probably one of the most orderly of the others, up to a certain point. And its function, in fact, on the base of the former Longobard administration, was a pretty damn efficient one. And the only problem, though, is that the conquest before and this other waves of invaders weren't helping a great much. Yet, it was the duty of the Carolingian emperor to defend the holiest places of Christianity. St. Peter, St. Paul here were ravaged by the Muslim pirates, right? So this at the time was a big trauma, right? It was considered like the failure, not just of the emperor as such, but as a consequence, a great punishment that God had inflicted to Christians, presumably for their bad conduct. And objectively, the Carolingians were exactly one of the best examples of, of concord, of unity, of peace, etc. And therefore, this was a dramatic time that was seen objectively and rightfully as a moment of decadence in some sort, for which the Christian emperors had to react to and wash this offense with blood, hopefully, right? This was enough. So Louis, that was 825, 875, son of the Emperor Lothar, descended into the Italic peninsula with an army composed of Franks, of Burgundians, of Provençals, let's say, troops from Provence, to which had united also the troops of Pope Sergius II, 844-847, the Duke of Venice, that was technically a Byzantine commander at this point, and also the Dukes of Spoleto and of Naples, right? Spoleto was a major duchy, right? Not like a city-state like Naples. It was a chunk of the former Longobard kingdom and subject of the Carolingians. In the meanwhile, the Beneventent prince had in turn hired certain Muslim mercenaries that at this point actually were acting in an uncontrolled fashion and had began to start pillaging and plundering the all around in the duchy and pushing up to the lands of the monastery of Monte Cassino, right? So you realize that these southern powers were really in trouble now because they couldn't contain the same mercenaries that they had hired, right? And this was creating much greater problems than what they had envisaged before. And also compromising these situations with the papacy, with the Carolingian Empire, because hell, here they were attacking Rome, the basilicas of the apostles, Monte Cassino, the center of Saint Benedict and the whole European evangelization. So it was a big deal, right? The Beneventent Prince Adelchis didn't renounce to use mercenaries himself. He obliged, therefore, the inhabitants of Bari that had remained faithful to him, because Bari had belonged, in fact, to the Longobard Duchy, to accept the protection of the Berber chief Khalfun, that was probably from Sicily and had come into the area via Taranto, and in exchange of money, he even allowed him to plunder and set on fire certain sacred buildings. And the Berber was so, it went so beyond at the point of razing to the ground the entire city of Capua. It was eventually rebuilt, right? Hence, in 848, Khalfun was de facto master of Bari, and the Prince Louis, having arrived into southern Italy exactly at that time, couldn't do anything but free Benevent from those mercenaries that had occupied it, and to set peace between the Longobard princes that were contending power, acting as a guarantor for the subdivision of the Beneventan territory into principalities ruled respectively by Benevent and Salerno, and also into the county of Capua. Alright, it was rebuilt. So this is very meaningful because what had happened is that the situation was completely out of control. Right, the Beneventans had tried to appease these Saracen chiefs that, however, simply used this to extend further their power. Benevent itself, it was the single most important Longobard city, had been occupied by the Saracens. The same Longobard powers were more interested in, splitting this major duchy into several parts. So when the Prince Louis arrives with his Carolingian army to try to restore the situation, kick out the Saracens from southern Italy, finds that Bari now is in complete control of the Saracens, that there is not much else he can do but getting rid of this rabble of Saracen mercenaries in Benevent, and he just has to accept that this territory would fragment further, right, by splitting in three into the cities that had all kind of their own dimension. Benevent was a kind of a mountain power with a rock powerful. Salerno was a maritime republic. Capua was a major agricultural center in the flatland. So this already tells you how the fragmentation of this territory, that once having been a fairly unitary entity, even with a certain fair degree of centralization, was now collapsing, in part not probably much to Saracen invasions themselves, but to the enmities existing between the Longobards that in turn were exploiting what was happening all around, instead of thinking of having maybe a bit more of general control what was going on. So as it often happened, even the success of these pirates, etc., as it happened also for the Vikings in Francia, etc., wasn't much of a power from the side of these pirates, but rather the internal fragmentation that caused it all. And just like the Carolingians sent the Vikings against one another, here basically that's what the Longobards and the Byzantine cities did in southern Italy, and and the Saracens profiting from it, right? Which is pretty meaningful overall. And this was definitely not an honorable solution, because the Carolingian emperor was supposed to show, to display much greater power and authority, and southern Italy was a pretty tough ground even for the same Carolingian armies. The Carolingians had tried to subdue the southern Longobard duchies, never actually managed to do it. It was a too difficult territory, and it was too far from the core of the empire. Hence, Pope Leo IV at this point was not appeased at all. He was actually pretty upset, and rightfully. He was pope between 847 and 855, and we owe to him the construction of the city wall around the area of St. Peter in Rome, that would be transformed thus into a citadel that in fact is known as the Leonine city. after what had happened with the aggression, Saracen aggression to St. Peter's Basilica, so that the profanation of 846 could not repeat itself. And it was under Leo IV patronage that in 849 a fleet that was put together by the Campanian cities defeated the Saracens of Ostia. Ostia had also been resettled with Corsican people that were allowed by the Pope to settle there, to defend it. And at this point, this victory sparked a bit more of hope from the Christian side. And from once again, Louis, that at the point had received in turn the imperial crown himself as co-regent, his father, moved again against Bari this time. So to the enterprise he had been pushed by the pleas of the abbots of Monte Cassino, also the other very important abbey on the of Saint Vincent on the Volturno, right? However, at this point, the Longobard princes supported him with so much laziness and so much hypocrisy as to induce him to withdraw indignantly and without having concluded anything, right? So this was typical. Right now, a bit more of unity had been reached, a bit more of stability allowed. Now this new campaign was directed to the main Saracen stronghold in southern Italy, this strong city of Bari, and yet the Longobards start fearing the Carolingian intervention in their lands and surroundings, and therefore, even though they probably have to fear from the Saracens, they are much more concerned about the Carolingians at the point of not helping them at all, right? And these expeditions are very interesting actually, because they were put together with considerable effort. Here we are at the mid-9th century, right? With the resources of the Italic kingdom. It wasn't small, but it wasn't even, this enormous resourceful power, so that, this expeditions show us a lot about the logistics of the time, the extremely tough ground of the Apennine, and with all the difficulties that you can imagine, and this lack of local support from the side of the Longobard princes that should have instead helped the emperor, right? But the Longobards want to remain on their own. This probably doesn't speak either much in favor of what Saracen power was really about, because evidently the Longobards themselves didn't fear it excessively much, right? Nevertheless, Bari kept being governed by an emir that was keeping to pillage and extorting money to the abbeys of Monte Cassino and Saint Vincent, and that also was, dealing with local powers, without forgetting to allow with benevolence, but for a fee, right? Certain safe conducts for the Christian pilgrims that passed through his city, right, from Christian Europe to pass for an embarkment, to find an embarkment for the Holy Land, right? This is particularly important because these ports also were already, of course, practiced by the Christian pilgrims going to the Holy Land. Another proof, by the way, that the Muslims hadn't blocked at all the access to the Holy Land at this point. Christian pilgrims always could pass there, and at their own risk, of course, because it was an easy journey, and they surely could have had bad surprises along the way. But still, this was a way to make a lot of money, right? Because these people paid they stopped. They paid tolls. They bought. Sometimes they even remain in these lands. Therefore, the Muslims had no interest whatsoever to stop Christian pilgrimage. The Emir of Bari also treated very cordially the prosper and educated Jewish community of Oria, of the Apulian city of Oria. So the Emperor Louis II at this time, however, had still not accepted the Apulian setback, right? So in 855, once that he had remained alone in his government, reattempted the conquest, being urged by the abbot of Monte Cassino, but also by the same Longobard lords of Benevent and of Capua, but not by the one of Salerno, because he actually was against them at the moment. So this always reveals the enmities that existed in this situation. And we still have the project of this new undertake that was entrusted to the Constitutio of 865 that contemplated a concentration of troops at the city of Lucera, right, in the following March. Lucera was a very important city, a Roman colony that, in fact, is present at the end of the Apennines and before the Apulian Plain, and that therefore was a pretty important strategic center to start the invasion of the Bari province, right? But however, it took another year for the emperor to overcome the mistrust and to thwart the double and triple games of his treacherous Longobard and Campanian subjects. Right, the campaign opened only in 867, and it and ended after complex events that lasted for that ended only 4 years later. Right, in 871. And also by benefiting from the Frankish troops sent by his brother Lothar II, that however were struck by an epidemics, and by the support of a Byzantine and a Venetian fleet with Croatian and Dalmatian reinforcements, and even the support of the Beneventan prince Adelchis and the people of Gaeta, albeit not the one of Naples, that on the contrary was offering its own port to the Saracen navies, the emperor finally managed to crush the Emirate of Bari under the rule of Sadvan, that had fought as a lion, and that also managed, by the way, as a tail strike, to sack during a sortie the famous sanctuary of Saint Michael on the Gargano. It was twinned with Mont Saint Michel, by the way. Very important Longobard. It's a pre-Roman sanctuary that eventually, during the early Middle Ages, had become extremely important for the religious spirituality of the Longobards of Benevent. And the same Sadvan, in fact, had obtained to retreat into Benevent, right, in which he lived basically in this golden prison, treated almost as a friend by the Prince Adelchis. So the magnanimity of the Carolingian emperor towards the emir was perhaps a mistake, because of course Bari had been reconquered, and it had been a pretty amazing feat, right? Because this was a pretty good accomplishment of the Italic kingdom in the Carolingian dynasty, and this undertake had really echoed in the Mediterranean, in Europe. But at the same time, and that's what tells you how complicated the strategic situation was. The Byzantine Empire, that had in turn come out of a long crisis, was reorganizing thanks to the energetic and unscrupulous work of Basil I, 867-886, the founder of the Macedonian dynasty, who, with his own fleet, had much favored, in fact, the same victory of the king of the Teutons, Louis, as actually the Byzantines call him, as they, of course, avoided to consider him an imperial, right, an equivalent of the Roman emperor, but in fact the king of the emperor of the Germans at best. And Basil definitely had no intention to grant the Carolingian to affirm his own authority on that southern Italy that at that point, since the times of the reconquest of the Italic peninsula by the side of Justinian, the Basileis of Constantinople deemed as their own territory, right? And that was particularly rich of many important portual cities, dominating which one could control the access to the Adriatic, right, where Hellenic culture had also deep roots, also in the Ionian Sea especially. And the diplomatic plots of Basil I and Sandoval actually had the desired effect. They triggered a revolt of the Beneventan Longobards that even managed to take the Carolingian emperor prisoner for almost 2 months, between the August and September of 871, while the emir of Kairouan was sending in Apulia another invading army, right? That it was strong as much as 20,000 men, allegedly, and that invested furiously Calabria and Campania, right? So that tells you how deep the enmity between, in this case, the Carolingians and the Byzantines, also with the support of the local Longobards, could cause actually a Saracen invasion. What we normally perceive like, these guys came out of nowhere to destroy our poor world. No, we called them there, right? And that was a freaking messed up thing, especially for all the people that were massacred in those raids, right? So this triggered, in turn, the new response of Louis II that found the strengths, which was remarkable actually, to rush into southern Italy and to defeat the Muslims in 873 at Capo, even though he died just 2 years afterwards. So this is a disconcerting picture if you really think about it, right? In the meanwhile, the Saracens hadn't stopped to act from their residual stronghold of Taranto, that in all this had remained in their hands. This was a great center for slave trade, right? The monk Bernard, passing by Taranto in 870, directed to the Holy Land, saw even 6 large ships loaded in slaves that were destined to the market of Alexandria of Egypt, right? Taranto was also very important strategically because aside from its magnificent port, the Saracens could threaten from there the lands of Apulia and of Campania up to the Volturno River. The population of Bari didn't also have any need at that point to maintain their tie with the Germanic Empire. In fact, in 876 they started turning to the Byzantine authorities that were operating from Otranto, right, on the strait, and they obtained that their city that was at this point fully included into the Byzantine context, in the Byzantine sphere, became the capital of the theme of Longobardia, right? So basically, this entire chunk of Apulia was lost by the Carolingians, that at this time were in deep crisis, as you know, and it passed to the Byzantines. And the Byzantines also managed in 880 to reconquer Taranto as well. So this is very interesting because the Emirate of Bari was reconquered by the Carolingians. The one of Taranto was reconquered by Byzantines. However, the Byzantines didn't manage in this context to prevent the Muslims to perpetrate their raids into the Adriatic Sea, which is very meaningful because they objectively now the empire controlled the major coastal centers of Apulia, and yet the Saracen navies still passed across the Otranto Strait. And 5 years before, in 875, the Saracens had even managed to reach Comacchio and Grado around Venice, right? So pretty far north, at the bottom of the Adriatic Sea. So it's that tells you how pervasive Saracen piracy was and how skilled their navies were at the same time. So the Arab Berbers were in fact far from being beaten at this point. While they were completing the occupation of Sicily with the conquest of Syracuse in 878 and of Taormina in 902, they also penetrated into Campania, where they allied themselves with Capua, with Salerno, right? So once again, local centers signed with the Saracens, and that reached once again the territories controlled by the Bishop of Rome, obliging him to pay a tribute and destroying the abbeys of St. Vincent and Volturno and of the one of Monte Cassino, establishing at the mouth of the Garigliano River in 882 a base that allowed them to keep in check the same city of Rome, right? And it's only 915 with a massive concerted effort of the papacy, of the Italic king, of the Byzantines, of certain companion coastal towns, etc. That nightmare was removed. The Christian coalition in 951 achieved this great victory that removed, in fact, the Saracen presence forever from the surroundings of Rome, right, and central Italy. But that's how far they got. They even reached at one point the Sabina area, with pillaging the abbey of Farfa as well, an important center close to Rome. So that at least was there is much to. I mean, certain powers, Gaeta on that occasion, for example, sided with the Saracens as well. So it was very difficult to regulate and all of these powers together to coordinate their force and to be to agree fundamentally about the general strategy. And yet that war coalition was in many ways the proof of a system, and albeit politically pulverized, still worked, right? The sum of local powers of the Italic kingdom, Byzantine help, of these maritime coastal cities that managed to expel the Saracens from that place. And the Caliphate emirs, once settled in Sicily, because here there were several dynasties that actually, even the same Saracen world, rose and fell, etc. They basically, the Caliphate settled in Sicily with the formal authority of the Fatimid Caliphates of the Cairo, right? Always remember that theoretically, the Fatimids had been ruling even over Tunisia and Sicily by at the distance, right? So this was a power that operated by legitimization from the central Shia power actually of Egypt, and therefore the Caliphs consolidated their power in the central Mediterranean and could start during the 10th century to attack systematically the coasts of southern Italy, especially the ones of Apulia and Calabria. There were certain occasional bridgeheads, such as Aghlabide in Campania and Saint Severina in Calabria, that existed for a long time, right, in Saracen control. The attempt of the Saxon Emperor Otto II that launched a new energetic campaign similar to the one that had undertaken his predecessor Louis II a century before, was crushed in 982 at Punta Stilo, right, in Calabria, where the Ottonian army suffered a massive defeat. Like, the cream of German nobility was annihilated, was wiped out, and that was a massive blow, because objectively the Ottonians, now you can't enter into the, now we are kind of diluting towards the end, but the Ottonians were at that point to reconnect all the unity of the Italic Peninsula, even bringing the papacy under their control. So that battle was quite important. It was a defeat at the hands of the Saracens, who, if they had not stood in the way, they might have altered sensibly the history of the West, because from those events eventually would cause all the crumbling of even Ottonian power. I mean, not just because of that battle, but if the Ottonians had won, they could have tightened the grip on Italy, and their power might have been sensibly boosted. So that in turn triggered the Gregorian Reformation, etc. So enormously important events. So from that moment onwards, we can say that the Saracen offensive in southern Italy didn't know any stop up to the death in 1036 of the Emir al-Akal, to which followed actually a massive crisis of Sicilian Islam, when the island started to pulverize, politically speaking, and therefore these incursions couldn't be coordinated anymore as before. Sardinia and Corsica remained up to the beginning of the 11th century a sort of no man's land, whose ports were all controlled by the Saracens, but the hinterland was a wholly different story, right? So those were, Saracens, but in the sense, very autonomous powers on their own, without any kind of central direction, right? And here we are very close, in fact, to the Norman conquest of southern Italy. At this point, the Normans were rising on their own in the south, and in a few decades they would start the invasion of Sicily that they wiped out without any particular difficulty. Conversely, however, it was now the Maghrebin coastal bases that went strengthening, right, and they were becoming fundamentally points of force for the Muslim thalassocracy into the Western Mediterranean. Between 1909 and 20 was founded, for example, the city fortress of Al-Madiyya on the Sahel's littoral, right, more or less at the height of the island of Pantelleria. And in 960, the Berber chieftain Buluggin ibn Ziri founded Algeria, right? That's quite a feat. In fact, later on the coast between Alger and Bona, was founded in 1060, the city of Buia. It's important to take a look at this northwestern Mediterranean edge here, especially for what concerns the Saracen Corsair war that was raging, starting from the Iberian, continental and insular bases. In fact, towards 890, that is almost contemporary to the settlement of the Saracens on the mouth of the Garigliano, the Muslim corsairs had arrived on the Provençal coast, and from there a group managed to organize a formidable nest at Fraxinetum, that is today's in France, Le Garde Freinet, not far from Saint-Tropez, that was also in fact occupied by the Saracens. Now, the base of Fraxinetum is probably one of the single most overlooked chapters of the Islamic invasions in Europe. There's this myth that in 732 the Franks stopped the invasion of the Muslims and everybody lived happily afterwards. No, in the immediate following years, Gaul was invaded once again. The Saracens settled into southern France and they remained there for basically 400 years. 300 years, maybe a bit less, but they actually remained there pretty damn long. The coastal regions of southern France were very developed. They were actually very Romanized areas. They were fairly similar to central and southern Italy in many ways. And there were rich cities that the Carolingians in the north had formally the sovereignty on, but very often not the power, especially now that the empire had disintegrated, to control. So the southern Gallic cities profited from this decentralized power, and albeit they were sometimes struggling for seizing power, and of course they were worried about invaders. They preferred sometimes to allow literally the Saracen presence at a local level, then to back the formation of more solid political entities in southern France. It was a great problem because in Burgundy, in the so-called Kingdom of Arles, the county of Provence was developing substantially. Think about figures like Hug of Provence that even became king of Italy and also emperor, if I'm not wrong, and that controlled Provence, Tuscany, Rome at one point. I mean, it was a pretty large system, but these Saracen presence kept infesting southern France, and the situation was much more complex, especially during the 10th century, throughout all the Ottonian period that we can imagine. Fraxinetum not only tormented with this Saracen incursions the internal territories that were immediately close, but they managed to organize also expeditions on a long range, right? And that sometimes were impressive. The main hits were definitely in cities like Marseille, Toulon, Nice, but sometimes they even crossed the Alps, right? And in Piedmont, that was raided often. These alpine passes were quite important because of the caravans of pilgrims that and for the merchants in transit, that were passing by. The Saracens from Fraxinetum in Provence even reached the Rhine Valley, right, in Germany. They arrived that far to pillage, right? Also, in 906, they destroyed the famous abbey of the Novalaise in Piedmont, right? So the area between the Gulf of the Lion and the Tyrrhenian Sea was also hit in contemporary by corsair comings from the Ifriqiya, right? Like the ones that from Al-Mahdiya between 934 and 935 reached Genoa and attacked it, right? Remember, at this time, even the Vikings reached Luni, in Liguria, right? So that this were areas that were definitely exposed to a lot of intense and attacks. But perhaps what is more interesting in this sense is the important Fraxinetum represented as a pirate base, but something much larger in the international policy in Europe, right? Basically, the base of Fraxinetum was backed by the Umayyad Caliphs for a very long time, and that's the reason why it resisted for so long. Objectively, Fraxinetum was very difficult to storm, right, as a position, but it was not impossible. You know, the Count of Provence eventually would do it when it was left free to do it. The point that there was a mandate here, a political mandate, to leave the Saracens in southern France from the same Christian emperors, because the Saxons at that point, the Ottonians, were dealing, diplomatically speaking, in a very careful way with the Umayyads of Spain. There was all a very complicated balance between these two major powers in Western Europe, you know, Ottonian Germany and Umayyad Spain, to maintain the balance over also the surrounding territories. This is not just a local history. This is not just about Italy or France, or this is a much broader system that at the time entailed the opportunity of the Ottonians, now that had the big guns in Europe, to maybe reinvade Italy, and that would have caused all new balances for what with the Byzantines, with the Caliphate of Cordoba. And the Caliphate was profiting from this pirate activity, so it didn't want it to stop. We have seen how the Saracens basically, through these bases, connected wide trade centers and you know, enriched their economy. The same, you know, coastal cities of Spain were, of course, within the same Umayyad control. There were very prosperous communities of this raids into the Tyrrhenian, into the Adriatic, brought a lot of slaves to Muslim trade. Some were castrated and educated as eunuchs for the high court. It was extremely profitable businesses. There were entire communities developing on the Spanish coast dealing to this. The Muslims sometimes kidnapping these people. Certain Jewish communities, for example, proceeding with these other things like castration, etc. And there is an enormously documented traffic for those time standards about these things. Never forget, you know, this the great dynamism and expansive capacities of the Jews. We have met them before in Oria, in Apulia, that were very important centers also in southern Spain. These were the great connectors of the whole Mediterranean trade, from which, broadly speaking, also these other three communities, like especially in southern Italy, like the city-states that weren't conquered by the Muslims, kept expanding and profiting and building their own ships and eventually managing to compete with the Saracens and eventually pushing them back. You know, in the 11th century, Pisa and Genoa will start to push back Saracen piracy. They would also participate to the Iberian Reconquista and to take away Saracen presence from the eastern Iberian coast. So you understand how all of this is intertwined. So Fraxinetum would eventually fall only when the Umayyad power will take away its own support from it. They said to the Ottonians, okay, you can get rid of it. And what triggered their end, actually, was an episode. Actually, the corsairs, the Saracen corsairs of Fraxinetum, had even managed to stipulate certain agreements with certain domini loci, that is, means the local lords in Latin, for example the Hague of Provence that we mentioned before, but they overdid, like they overstepped, because in 973 they kidnapped, probably without even planning that, like they normally did with whoever passed, a monk that was passing to this alpine paths between Italy and France, and they kidnapped him for ransom, like as they used to do. this monk was the powerful and venerated Maiolo, Saint Maiolo, abbot of Cluny. And at this point, the Provençal aristocracy was put in motion. Like, this was a big thing. It was like the measure that was excessive in this, and they armed their own expedition, and they finally got rid of the nest of Fraxinetum. That today you can also visit in southern France. Southern France has beautiful landscapes, beautiful coasts. I've spent many days on those beaches, and it's amazing, and it has an amazing history as well. Occitania, largely in southern France, has a lot of beautiful places to visit. Close to there is Saint-Tropez, there is Nice, there is the Rhine, where there were the monastic communities in late Roman Gaul, was extremely important. Aghlabide is fantastic. Orange, visit those places because they really deserve a beautiful spring vacation in southern France. It's really worth it. And feel it, because when you are there and you breathe that air, you feel that connection. You feel like, especially the western you go, that there is this proximity of Spain, that there is this proximity of Italy, there's Mediterranean dimension, there's cultures that got crossed with others, and different flavors and styles and atmospheres. It is really beautiful. And just thinking that this didn't end, like the Muslim presence in southern France remained up to the 11th century. It was a very long thing. It's often deeply overlooked how long it lasted, right? Just know that in the 16th century, even Francis I offered the Ottomans the part of I think the same part of Marseille, actually. It was populated with Turks, right? It's how close to certain dimensions this is, right? And what I find fascinating is broader picture. Today we don't talk about the Christian comeback, and we will have to do actually at one point, talking especially about the Italian maritime republics and the Iberian Reconquista. But I would say it's observing how every region, even how every provincial dimension had its own story, had its own development, had its own times, its own dynamics, and how you can't tell the story in a monolithic way. It was something that I rediscovered, especially this year that is finishing, I would say by dealing with this stuff and also talking about them with you, is how deep actually we have, how deep was the contact between the Muslims and the Christians for literally since the very first Islamic invasions, right? There are so many incoherences and sometimes in how we tell that story. We told, for example, about the history of the Crusades as if one day the Europeans woke up and said, you know what, we will simply now strike the Muslims back and we'll go to fight in the Near East. That is the moment in which Europe is literally, rocketing and that, which the great development has already happened. But what about the Reconquista? That lasted for centuries before. What about southern Italy and the effort, even the maritime republics, even the Normans? That was a fight against the Islamic invasions that began immediately, right? You can't say that the Islamic invasions at one point started in the 7th century and nobody did anything about it up to the Crusade. It's basically grossly ignoring 400 years of history without understanding what all this largely southern European or however Mediterranean dimension has been about. And this is grossly overlooked. And the more I read about this, the more I realize how we deal the age of the Crusades, like as if the Crusades were something. They were objectively something different, but they were something different, much more different from what concerned, for example, the the imperial and royal and papal relation than it was in terms of sheer fight between Christians and Muslims, because that had already begun ever since these Islamic invasions had begun. And these examples in southern Italy, in southern Gaul, tell you also how much this dichotomy is largely not present, which is interesting because at another level, for example, take northern Italy, that is pretty close, right? It's between the south and southern Gaul. Take even the Byzantine Empire, or they had very different approaches to this. The Pop Valley, for example, aside from these attacks in Piedmont we see here, they had a wholly different. They had the Magyars, for example, just like the Germans had the Magyars. Even if the Saracens raided from the Alps, even the Rhine Valley at one point. But there are sometimes at a relatively small distance, different stories, different paths, different directions that show you how the concerted effort that existed definitely was, however, much more shaded the more you go down to the provincial scale, which sounds probably very banal at one point, because you understand that it's always been like that. It's always like that. And that's a reason why we can't generalize. But it also shows you how the local dimension is objectively still the most important. I mean, looking at how a politically fragmented Europe from this mess was able to grow, like the 10th century, this moment of terrible invasions and whatever, that was actually a moment of growth of the European continent from the within, right? And this is something that's been widely studied. We talked about it on Schwerpunkt a lot of times, and part of the trick of this is the sources, right? And this is a historiographical advice in general, or historical advice, and more simply, that is, never think that since there is not evidence for something, nothing happened. Because actually, from all the hints we have, we know that a lot of damn things happened. So that's what I said at the beginning of the video. That don't think that this was just a moment of destruction, of terror, of fear. It was also a moment of intelligence, of application, of development, of things of problems that were solved, that empowered local polities, right? And that's the reason why in the 11th century you see Europe that from Spain, from the Crusades in the Near East, from the Italian maritime republics, started to overwhelm the other side. The trade balance shifted from Islam to Europe. It was a massive expansion that all had its roots in this very alleged darkest hour that we have depicted. And it was a pretty messed up moment, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that it was a positive period in this regard. These invasions were pretty destructive, and they caused a lot of problems. But at the same time, I think that response was exactly the proof of two things, that of the same pressure, of course, that this invasions triggered, but at the same time, the enormous resources that were potentially there in Europe that overly expanded afterwards. But it's never like there's not a watershed. You can't see these things happening since very early in time. And not even the invasion in itself is the single most important thing, and you can't interpret it as the single most important thing, right? And we will definitely deepen this topic sooner or later, because first of all, it's very interesting, which I hope you agree on. But secondly, it's probably one of the least, most superficially studied aspects of the Middle Ages. I don't know why, because frankly, this is not just maybe a lack of interest for a certain time, a problem, maybe certain national historiographies concentrate on other periods. This is a bit like how we have really conceived the whole picture of the Middle Ages, right? It's difficult to ask for a change in this sense, because we are so rooted. Like, if you go on those videos about it's plenty of videos about the Crusades. Today I was looking at that. There are topics of about medieval history that are of overwhelming and brutal and violent importance that nobody even mentions here. Instead, you find period like a crusade, of course, enormously important, but it's the internet, by contrast, is overflowed with that, and most of it is just like, whose fault was for all the wars? It was the Christians? Was it the Muslims? Right? And that's all what the dialogue polarizes upon. What I hope you have understood by following, if you follow this, Crusader, let's say, this chap, that I have a playlist about Crusades history, etc., is that I don't concentrate on that. To me, it's not important, right? I don't think historically that's the problem. And yet there are many people who are also prepared that have to get to focus on that, to presume that whichever thing you say, you fit into that category and that other category, whichever it is, right? It's not just Christian or Muslim, it's just theist or atheist, and many other things. We have to reject this. This is history. History is what you can understand through the sources, not what you presume it has to be like, which doesn't mean to throw away the concept of religion, which doesn't mean to throw away the concept of intercultural clash, which doesn't mean that there wasn't violence, whatever. This is history, as ugly as it can be, but it's still history, and as such we have to study it in the most objective possible way. But should be all what the historians of war should revolve around. It's literally an exercise of intelligence. You can't write history by presuming to enforce your own personal views. It's not history in the first place, but this is how many people have been presented with history still today, right? It's weird how, for example, I usually share my videos on Facebook groups, and those who are dedicated to history, like, probably, okay, you understand that the majority of people are not excessively, they're not experts, right? They are there because they want to learn, which is very good. And there's actually a lot of people, but if you isolate from that, you want to basically to share, so there's not much of a problem. If you share these videos on, for example, groups that are about common knowledge, right, that includes history and other things, and you present this stuff, you realize that this average generic member doesn't quite even have the intellectual tools to make these ideas fitting in their own sphere of range of things that can be thought, right? Because they automatically, either they have antibodies, I don't know, when I made that video about the Merovingian, the construction of the Merovingian political ideology with the Christians, the sacralization of the Carolingian, of the Merovingian monarchy, I received an overwhelming reaction. Like, a lot of people say, "Oh, here we can't talk about religion. Religion is not interesting." That was literally about the political ideology of the Merovingian kingdom, and those people mistook it from religious propaganda. And I think that if you're a regular follower, you know that here we don't make any sort of propaganda of sort, right? We try to tell history, of course, and we can't be 100% neutral, because no human being on this earth has ever, unfortunately will never be. But there is a barrier, this is what I'm talking about, in today's society, to be opened to understanding, and this is the and history is understanding of politics, of society. So I think the more people study history, and the less are ideologized, and the least they are dogmatic and fanatic, and sometimes the same dogmatism and fanatism that is to be witch hunted into certain topics like, I don't know, history of it's actually the reflection that dogmatism and irrationality want to be criticized is owned by the same person who has that attitude. And this is also what we often forget, and never forget that certain because at the end of the day, this is the deep mistake that people do, that they presume that certain patterns of interpretation that the cultures have, that human groups have throughout history, can be erased by washing it away with a sponge, in a second, right? It's never like that. It's literally most of the times in history, same patterns, the same mental forms of interpretation. We are always the same people, biologically speaking. We reason basically always the same way. And whatever, now I'm digressing, let's cut it off. But for saying that these topics matter, and it does matter to talk about them, not for picking side, but for trying to understand, to get closer at least to the truth, right? Yeah, as long nobody owns the truth, nobody ever will, right? But we can get closer to it. That's what we can do about it. Which believe me, it does make a great difference. It does make a big difference. But that's the other story, right? That's if you presume that instead you know what is black and what is white, and you don't accept that everything is a shade of in the middle, it's very difficult to have a conversation with anyone, right? And sometimes it's difficult to do it, believe me. However, I think tomorrow I will not be posting, so but I think on January the 1st I will. So in this episode, I wish you a happy New Year's Eve for tomorrow, and a happy 2020. Funny number. And I hope your next year to be better than anyone. As long as you hope it, it makes a difference, right? If you don't give up, if you keep on thinking you can make a difference, you will never lose, because whichever thing you will do, even if it doesn't go as you wished, but you made that effort and it did make a difference, right? And that's, in my opinion, the spirit of it. That never give up. Never back down, and never be, always be propositive about what you can do, because you can do a lot. I'm talking about you. You can do everything you want if you really want it, right? And that's the most beautiful thing we have here. Let's not waste it, right? So once again, I wish you a happy new year, and for now, I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time, and see you next time. Bye.